It was found buried beneath Alexandria, inside the ruins of a forgotten library, a fragment of a scroll, its ink faded, its language strange. No one could believe what it said, for written in those ancient Greek letters was a philosophy so bleak, so dangerous, that later scholars refused to translate it fully. It spoke of a world without meaning, of gods who were deaf, of happiness that was an illusion, and of death, not as tragedy, but as freedom. The man who wrote it lived over 2,300 years ago. His name was Hegesias of Cyrene, a philosopher so feared that his words were said to drive men to suicide. The Greeks called him Pisithenatos, the death persuader. He lived in a time when the great schools of philosophy, Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, and the Stoic Stoa, filled Athens with arguments about virtue, happiness, and the purpose of human life. Every teacher promised meaning. The Stoics said happiness came from duty. The Epicureans said it came from pleasure. Plato said it came from truth. But Hegesias looked at the same world and saw nothing. He saw slaves chained in markets, soldiers dying in foreign wars, the rich feasting while the poor starved. And he asked the question no one dared to. If suffering is inevitable and pleasure fleeting, why live at all? According to ancient sources, he wrote a dialogue, now lost, called The Death by Starvation. In it, a man calmly reasons with his friends about why life is not worth living. He lists every sorrow, every failure, every false promise. And in the end, he dies, not in agony, but in peace. When the scroll was read aloud in Alexandria, the audience fell silent. Some wept, some trembled, and then, it said, many of them went home and chose to follow the man in the story. That night, Hegesias' fame spread across the Greek world like a shadow. The Egyptian King Ptolemy II, fearing mass despair, ordered his lectures banned. His name was erased from many records. His books disappeared, some say burned, others say hidden in secret vaults beneath the library of Alexandria. But whispers of his teachings survived, in fragments, in quotes, in warnings. And those who read them swore they had glimpsed something terrifyingly familiar, the same emptiness that would later echo through the writings of Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and the birth of modern nihilism. Because long before anyone spoke of the death of God, there was a Greek who declared that the gods had never lived at all. Hegesias had looked into the heart of existence and found only silence. He said, "The wise man neither seeks life nor fears death, for both are void." But who was this man? Why did he abandon every belief his civilization stood upon? And what happened to the forbidden scroll that carried his words, the one said to curse those who read it? To answer that, we must travel back to Cyrene, a city of sun and marble, where philosophy was both a luxury and a weapon, and where one man's despair would ignite a quiet revolution against the meaning of life itself. Long before his name was whispered in fear across Alexandria, Hegesias of Cyrene had been just another philosopher in a small North African city, a disciple of Aristippus, founder of the Cyrenaic school. The Cyrenaics believed life's purpose was simple, pleasure. To them, the good life was measured not in virtue, nor piety, but in the intensity of joy. Aristippus taught that the wise man should seize pleasure like a ripe fruit, for tomorrow, death might snatch it away. But Hegesias was not like his teacher. He listened to those lessons, and in his cold, sharp mind, a darker thought began to grow. If pleasure was the goal, he reasoned, then life was a losing game. For every pleasure fades, every joy ends, and the memory of happiness only makes the pain that follows more unbearable. He looked around at Cyrene's marble courtyards, the perfume of its gardens, the laughter of its banquets, and saw nothing but a mask over suffering. The pursuit of pleasure, he wrote, is merely the pursuit of a shadow. His students, at first, were intrigued. His words were unlike anything they had heard. They expected wisdom to uplift, to bring light. But Hegesias' philosophy was like looking directly into the void. He argued that the world itself was built on cruelty, that nature did not care whether men lived or died, and that even the gods, if they existed, were indifferent to human cries. To live, he said, was to cling to a boat already sinking. And so the only true freedom was found in letting go. The wise man, Hegesias claimed, does not hope, for hope is the child of delusion. He does not love, for love binds him to pain. He does not fear, for he has already accepted the nothingness that waits. His students were horrified, yet entranced. Some argued with him. Others began to believe. Rumors spread through Cyrene like wildfire, of a man who denied the gods, who said happiness was impossible, who preached that death was not evil but release. The priests of Apollo called him blasphemer. The city council called him madman. But the young and restless called him teacher. They gathered in the gymnasia, whispering of his strange doctrine. Some claimed that after his lectures, students would vanish for days, retreating into silence, some never returning. Then came the scroll. It was said that Hegesias wrote it not for fame, but for finality, to preserve his philosophy in a form that could not be twisted or softened by others. He titled it Apocarteron, the man who starved himself to death. It told the story of a man who, having measured the world's suffering and found it greater than its joy, calmly chose to die of hunger. He did not beg the gods for mercy. He did not curse them. He simply refused to play the game of life any longer. When the scroll was first read aloud in the library of Alexandria, the audience sat frozen. The silence that followed was heavy, until the next morning, when reports spread that several listeners had taken their own lives. King Ptolemy II Philadelphus intervened at once. Hegesias' teachings were declared forbidden. His lectures banned. The man himself watched, questioned, silenced. But it was too late. The words were out. Copies of the scroll were made in secret, carried by travelers, hidden in wax tablets, passed from hand to trembling hand like a sacred curse. They said the scroll was cursed because it did not lie. It showed the truth too clearly, that life was not divine, not moral, not meaningful. It was only motion. And for some, seeing that truth meant never wishing to move again. But what forced Hegesias to reach such a depth of despair? What in his life turned philosophy into a weapon against hope itself? To understand that, we must descend deeper into the personal loss, betrayal, and revelation that gave birth to his forbidden doctrine. Before the darkness, Hegesias had known light. He was born into a world of abundance, the city of Cyrene, resting like a jewel on the North African coast, rich with trade, art, and learning. His father was a scholar, his mother a priestess of Aphrodite, devoted to the goddess of love and beauty. From childhood, he was surrounded by the promise of meaning. The gods were said to care. Life was said to matter. But then came the plague. It swept through Cyrene like an invisible fire, devouring rich and poor alike. Hegesias' father was among the first to die. His mother, once radiant and devout, fell into despair. She prayed for mercy, to Aphrodite, to Asclepius, to any god who might hear. None answered. She died whispering the goddess's name. For Hegesias, something broke that day. He walked through the temple after her death, seeing the offerings, the statues, the golden altars, and realized they were silent stone. He began to write, not hymns, but questions. If the gods exist, why do they delight in our suffering? If they do not exist, then why do we? He left the priesthood behind and sought answers in philosophy, traveling to Athens to study the teachings of Aristippus. There he learned the Cyrenaic creed. Pleasure is the only good. But as he walked through the city's broken streets after the Peloponnesian War, seeing beggars, orphans, and mutilated soldiers begging before temples, he realized how hollow that teaching was. Pleasure is a lie told by those who have enough to afford it, he wrote. Returning to Cyrene, Hegesias turned his grief into logic. He dissected the soul with the precision of a surgeon. Every reason for living, love, virtue, glory, pleasure, fortune gives, fortune takes. No man commands happiness, only the illusion of it. It was in this state that he began to write his most infamous work, the scroll that would later be called the Death Persuader. It opened with a scene as quiet as it was terrifying. A man sits alone at night, a single lamp burning beside him. He lists everything that life offers: love, wealth, fame, and one by one, strips them away with reason until nothing remains but emptiness. Then, in the final passage, he thanks the gods for one mercy, that death is always near. Hijisha's friends begged him to burn it. They said such words could drive men to madness. But he laughed, not cruelly, but hollowly, and said, "Madness is believing there is meaning in misery." And yet, even as he embraced the void, there was something tragically human beneath his despair. Plato had spoken of the soul's longing for perfection, Aristotle of reason's desire for truth. Hijisha, in his own way, longed for peace, for the silence that follows understanding. His writings began to circulate quietly among scholars in Alexandria, men who had grown weary of divine pretenses. They saw in Hijisha not madness, but clarity. One anonymous papyrus from that time reads, "He is not the enemy of life, but its mirror. Through him, we see that our joy is only the mask of sorrow." Yet the power of his ideas was too great to remain buried in philosophy. Ordinary men began to quote him. Merchants, soldiers, slaves, all began to whisper his name when misfortune struck. Soon, it was said, those who heard him speak would either awaken or break. Some left his lectures enlightened, others never returned home. When King Ptolemy II heard the rumors, he summoned Hijisha to Alexandria, not to honor him, but to silence him. That meeting, between a ruler who believed in order and a philosopher who believed in nothing, would decide whether the death persuader lived or vanished forever. The court of Ptolemy II Philadelphus shimmered with wealth. Ivory pillars gleamed under oil lamps. Incense of myrrh hung heavy in the air, and golden mosaics of Isis and Serapis watched from the walls. But at the center of all that splendor stood a man with bare feet, tattered robes, and eyes like cold fire. Hijisha of Cyrene. He had been summoned from his small lecture hall under threat of imprisonment. For weeks, his teachings had spread through Alexandria like a sickness of the soul. Merchants abandoned their stalls, students renounced study, lovers parted without a word. Some, it was said, starved themselves to death, believing Hijisha's words that to live was to prolong pain. The king's guards brought him before the throne, where Ptolemy sat wrapped in Tyrian purple, his crown glinting like the sun. "You are the one they call Pisithenatos," the king said, his voice measured. "The death persuader." Hijisha bowed slightly. "If truth persuades men to die, Majesty, then the fault is not mine." The court gasped. Ptolemy narrowed his eyes. "You speak as though life itself were worthless. Yet you stand here alive. Explain yourself." Hijisha met the king's gaze, unflinching. "I live because I do not fear death. That is all." He spoke with a calm that unsettled everyone in the room. The king's philosophers, standing nearby in jeweled robes, whispered among themselves. They had debated happiness for years, but none had dared to strip it bare as this man had. Ptolemy rose, descending the steps until he stood face to face with Hijisha. "You destroy faith. You turn men against hope, against the gods. Do you not see what your words cause?" "I see only what has always been," Hijisha replied softly. "Men suffer. The gods do nothing. I have merely spoken what others are too afraid to see." For a moment, silence filled the hall. Even the musicians stopped playing. Ptolemy studied him, this ragged philosopher who spoke as though thrones and crowns were illusions. Finally, he said, "You believe nothing matters?" "I believe that nothing lasts," Hijisha answered, "and that men destroy themselves chasing what cannot be kept. You, king, build monuments to eternity, but eternity swallows all monuments." It was not rebellion in his voice, but truth, the kind that bruises pride. Ptolemy's face hardened. "Then you leave me no choice. Your lectures are forbidden. Your writings will be sealed. Alexandria will not be the graveyard of men's faith." A murmur ran through the court, half relief, half fear. Hijisha bowed again. "Ban words if you must, Majesty, but you cannot ban the thought that births them." That night, Hijijas was escorted from the palace and ordered never to teach publicly again. The scroll of the death by starvation was confiscated, locked deep within the archives of the Library of Alexandria, sealed with the royal sigil. Officially, the philosopher was silenced. Unofficially, he became legend. In the taverns, sailors whispered that the king's archivist who handled the scroll fell ill afterward. Scholars who studied it lost their appetite for life. Others claimed that a secret sect of students preserved copies and read them in candlelight, believing the text contained not despair but liberation, the courage to face life's emptiness without illusion. The story spread far beyond Egypt. In the markets of Antioch, travelers spoke of a Greek who had defeated the fear of death. In Syracuse, poets quoted fragments of his words. Even in Athens, the cradle of reason, young philosophers debated his claim that pleasure is merely the brief forgetfulness of pain. Hijijas himself retreated into obscurity. He lived in a small stone house overlooking the desert. When asked by a friend what he did there, he answered, "I wait, as all men do. But I wait awake." He died years later, quietly, without disciples at his side. But his scroll, that forbidden seed of thought, did not die with him. For in the centuries that followed, when faith crumbled and meaning began to fade from human hearts, that lost voice from Cyrene would rise again and find new prophets in a darker age. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Rome, Byzantium, the empires of faith and conquest. And yet, buried beneath them all, the ghost of Hijijas lingered. His words, sealed away in Alexandria's archives, survived in whispers and fragments. Then one day, fire consumed the library. Scrolls turned to ash. Names were lost forever, but not all. Among the rescued remnants was a damaged papyrus, and signed, undated, that spoke of a philosopher who declared life meaningless. The fragments were carried to Antioch, then Constantinople, and centuries later, copied into Arabic by scholars of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. To them, it was a curiosity, a text without gods, without hope, written by a man centuries before Christ who seemed to speak like a modern. They called him Al-Hakim al-Madam, the sage of nothingness. And his ideas began to echo again, in the minds of men who saw the decay of certainty. In Europe, after the fall of faith and the rise of reason, the same question that haunted Hijijas returned. If the universe is indifferent, why should man pretend it is not? By the 19th century, a German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, would famously proclaim that God is dead. But 2,000 years earlier, a man from Cyrene had already written its shadow. The gods are silent. The wise man must live as if they never spoke. In Arthur Schopenhauer, the echo was clearer still. He wrote of existence as suffering, desire as a trap, happiness as illusion, the very ideas that had driven Hijijas' lectures into exile. Schopenhauer called life a business that does not cover its costs. Hijijas might have smiled, not in joy, but in recognition. And when nihilism emerged in the modern age, the belief that life has no inherent meaning, it carried, buried within it, the same seed sown in Cyrene centuries before, that truth, stripped of illusion, leaves only the void. But perhaps Hijijas was misunderstood. Maybe his message was not a call to despair, but to freedom, a liberation from false hopes, a challenge to face existence without gods, without masks, without lies. Perhaps when he said, "The wise man will neither fear life nor death," he was not destroying meaning, but urging men to create it for themselves. In this light, the death persuader becomes something else, not a preacher of suicide, but the first prophet of existential thought. In a world where men still chase pleasures that vanish, where suffering still defines existence, Hijijas' question remains more alive than ever. If happiness is a lie, will you still choose to live? The lost scroll may never be found, but its words are written everywhere, in the disillusioned heart of modern man, in the silence after faith, in the restless search for purpose amid chaos. The philosopher who once defied a king did not die in obscurity. He lives each time someone stares into the void and refuses to look away.